Amrita,
Bhakti.
can we ever banish the ghosts from our past?
Oh, sure. I think I'll just pay my astrologer to do it and my tarot reader. Wait, also my psychic, I think.
Yeah, so just throw money at your ghosts. That's what I'm hearing here,
And
right?
still they don't go away.
Yeah, well, we have to get serious about this topic. We have an actual ghost story writer joining us today, Jessica Faleiro, who writes about haunted Goa, but then she also writes about like families and family secrets and all these weird things she experienced in the past. So I hope she's going to spill the tea, right? But basically, it seems that we do spend a lot of energy repressing stuff and then paying a bunch of astrologers and tarot readers and psychics to like banish our issues or our ghosts, right?
Right. And somehow they should be predicting how we live and how we should not live. So,
Yes.
and yet we don't look inward. But this conversation itself, I am absolutely really interested about. I just came out of watching Haunting in Venice uh,
Oh,
by Christie and Hercule Poirot. That's a whole conversation, and it talks about haunting in very specific ways. But it just made me think about, what do you mean by ghost, Bhakti? There's so many different definitions out there. What is a
I know.
ghost?
I know. I guess the question that we asked, I almost mean it metaphorically, like the baggage from our past traumas or things that have happened, stuff that we are unable to break out of, bad patterns. But of course, I also mean, and I think this is where Jessica comes in, like actual ghost sightings and paranormal activity stuff we don't make sense of, but then we lock them away in this psychology box. But for me, always ghosts, and maybe this is because like I study literature and history or whatever or culture, but
Right.
it's always about history and how different cultures deal with personal and political histories.
Right. And you're absolutely right. I'm thinking, I come from Calcutta and I was born there, and I was fascinated growing up learning that the
Mhm.
word bhoot, that we know so very well as ghosts,
Mhm.
actually means the past in Bengali. So,
Wow. Okay.
literally the ghost of the past in this case, right? And, what you said about history in the past. So these ghosts are elements from the past that are repressed, and they're coming back to tell us something, right? If
Mhm.
only we will listen.
Oh God.
So
Yeah.
I want to know though, let's start off with, do you have a ghost experience, Bhakti?
Oh God. Uh, um, I've spent a lot of time avoiding ghost experiences. So I guess I believe that they exist. So I've not had a proper ghost experience that I can narrate or like, make lemonade out of. But I have had this idea of like a presence or like the weight of something inexplicable in the room.
Mm,
And like the thing is that my dad worked as a civil engineer, and he for a long time he worked on dam projects which were in very remote parts of India. So I lived in like very strange isolated homes on top of hills, nothing, howling wind type of stuff, which can be very beautiful, but I recall or like physically sense some very strange moments. But
mm,
I'll be very honest, like I'm not open to it. That's because I'm like a scaredy cat. Like I'm scared of everything. So maybe I'm super repressed, like I don't like being in the dark or being alone. And so I feel there are people who are more receptive. And I guess, Jessica will answer that question is like, are you able to receive those experiences? Some better than the others. But
right.
I don't know. What about you? Any weird stuff, weird stories?
It goes back to, because it's so fresh in my mind. There's this line in Haunting in Venice that talks about, whether it happened or not, we had that experience, right? And sometimes I also think that a space itself lends to becoming ghostly or spooky in a way that our projections are there. And I'm thinking about this particular incident when I moved to a house in New Jersey. This is long ago,
Wow.
and my family was helping me build furniture, like put together IKEA furniture. And it was an empty house, right? Again, these kinds of associations in a collective memory, that empty house, new house. We have so many of these films that, new empty
Yeah.
house, people moving in, something happens. So I kind of tell myself that probably came from there. But sitting together, making the furniture, and the house is absolutely empty. And then we heard footsteps in the corridor coming closer and closer and closer, and it stopped at the door, it, in the room where we were, right at the door. And I first felt that I'm just hallucinating, that it's probably just me hearing things. And
Yeah.
then I looked at the person in front of me, helping me with the furniture, and I saw the horror on the person's face in front of me. And then I realized that we both had heard it. and
Wow.
and I don't live there anymore, but I still think about that moment. We never found out anybody, dropped the furniture, we left the house, and I kept thinking, oh my goodness, I will never be able to live in this house ever.
Okay.
Much later, when I left that place, I did try to dig around, and there had been a death in that house. I don't know
Okay.
what happened.
As there are deaths in many houses, but
Exactly. So is it my projection of a fear? But
mhm.
something very weird happened that day that some of us heard.
I love that every second you're narrating that story, you had to kind of use rational language to explain, like, oh, it's
Exactly.
because I watched some movies. Oh, blah, blah, blah. And I think we do that constantly. And this is also about the receptiveness theory
Exactly.
that I have, and I think like thinking about this episode or thinking about this question or the fact, reading a bit of Jessica's book, I do remember like stories of trance possession, when
Yeah.
people get possessed with ghosts and I know there were aunts in my family where that happened almost on an annual basis at certain things, and it's a very violent event because their body kind of throws back, and it's very intense, and they start to speak in a very strange voice because they get
Other
possessed.
voices.
Yeah, and in Marathi they say the word, it's called angatyeta, like it enters your body, like something enters
Mhm.
your body. And it's also like tends to be women, and I know that also in certain temples you will see these women, and you always find somebody, another woman or somebody else who will like whack them to snap them out of this or something, or sometimes you're looking for answers. So I have seen that, and I remember being utterly and absolutely terrified of those things. But then I also remember seeking those experiences. Like I did play the Ouija board as a kid, trying to bring back dead people. Like, oh, am I going to have a boyfriend? And what's his name going to be? And all these stupid, like, stupid now, but like we're trying to connect with something. We're trying to
Yes.
connect.
I think that's actually at the bottom of this. I mean, it's a cultural expression, right? We are trying to move
Yeah,
beyond realms of rationality and trying to seek an access between the living and the beyond and what is, right? And because we don't know or have an expression of this, maybe these are all symbols of getting there or trying to access. So what I'm trying to also think about is culturally, so many of these symbols or metaphors are so similar, right?
yeah,
Thinking of, in again, my experiences are so rooted in Bengal, and I think all of India have this kind of, the pattern of sitting with ghost stories. All families have something or the other. But
yeah.
I'm thinking of the idea of the 14 candles right before Kali Puja. Houses will have 14 candles called Bhut Chaturdashi. And it's similar to the idea of All Souls Day, when candles are put outside the house, and both are
Mhm.
inviting the ancestral spirits to guide.
Right.
And so, what we are thinking about is trying to make sense of our
Right.
present life, and culturally making an expression or a symbol with that. But
Mhm.
all of this is a part of ourselves, is an encounter with the self ultimately, don't you
Yeah.
think? As in,
No,
you're
I
saying.
agree. I agree. I agree. And it's interesting what you're saying about the cultural things. Before I left, like, Bombay or India to come to the US, I just assumed that we are a culture of people who have a really like huge soft spot for these things, whether it's astrology, whether it's like, this kind of obsession with like prediction, trying to find out, is this a good period to do something, bad period. I also thought it's like a Hindu fixation. But then I, went to Bard College, which is in upstate New York, and it's like 1,000 acres and it's in the woods. And I found out right away that it's considered the epicenter of this sort of enchanted, haunted part of like New York State or something, and that people have had very strange experiences, pianos playing by themselves, an entire song being recorded, like very strange stories. So I was like, oh, okay. And the Ouija board, I didn't have the name for it when I was in India, but then of course I found out like all Americans are playing with the Ouija board. So I like the notion that these are different cultural expressions, but they're also the same. And I think I always come back to like wanting to cope with history, personal or political. Like,
Right.
I think it's always about like the haunted building because something happened there, or like something really screwed up that happened in your family that nobody
Yeah.
wants to talk about until like somebody gets possessed.
Yeah. No,
So,
and I think that's something that we do need to focus on, which is this idea about hauntings from the past. I mean, this is about repressed stuff, repressed things, memories coming back.
mhm,
But sometimes these are radical things. These are also subversive, resistant ideas, and kind
yeah,
of resisting to patriarchy. I'm thinking about the again this kind of folklore about mecho petni in Bengali, which is fishy spectral entities, or churels, as we know in the kind of Indian language,
right.
Hindi. But the idea is that these were young widows. I much later in life learned that these were young widows who really loved eating fish, and then they became this kind of spectral entities after death. But it's rooted in the lack, in the desire, also in the kind of patriarchal oppression that these repressed energies are coming back to resist. So in a way, these are also about um, repressed past coming back to correct things, repair things, or making us listen in some
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah. Huh. That's interesting. What you're saying about like feminist hauntings, or reminds me of a brilliant film from Senegal called Atlantics, which is like these group of women at night turn into zombies, and they are basically avenging the deaths of their male partners who were not paid by this corporate boss, and then they went and they died. And it's wild, and it's really this idea of like women seeking this revenge,
Right, right.
but seeking it through this like alternate other life outside of the boundary of the living, and so on. So I like
Right.
the politicizing of the ghosts that you're doing here. And I think Jessica has some stuff that's also about like colonial hauntings and things like that,
I
right?
think Jessica writes specifically about Goa and its past about with Portuguese colonialism, and I'm also thinking about fascinating stories. There's this really great book, actually by Rick Sundar Banerjee, and I think he is a ghost scholar writing about ghosts in India, and
Yeah.
I think he has written about Warren Hastings, the really archetype of colonial administrator in Bengal,
Yeah.
and Calcutta is filled with ghost stores and ghost, spooky
Really?
buildings. Yes, and there's this whole. I've constantly heard about this, that the ghost of Warren Hastings, who was impeached in the 18th century in England because of what he did in India, and there's this whole folklore about his ghost keeping alive, coming back in this Warren Hastings building because he's
Huh.
searching for the black box
Mm.
where his documents were, which would have proven his innocence, but he never finds it and he's impeached. So that so many people have said that they've seen the ghost coming back and it's searching for something. And of course, is it true? We don't know, but strange sightings have happened near the Hastings house. But it's literally a manifestation of the colonial haunting, right? That
Mm.
these spaces have had these very dark histories.
Mm.
And again, you mentioned the revenge metaphor, and in this case it's not so much revenge, but that pattern, not just in a Western symbol, but also in India. Did you watch that film called Bulbul? It's about
I
this.
am literally scared of these. I don't watch them. I'm not joking. I find them terrifying. I find them to be real. I know you're supposed to think of them as like existing outside of the real, or to enjoy, or to be fearful and then laugh, or I don't know what it's supposed to do, but I don't, I have that gene missing, you know?
Or I also want to know why we like to feel scared and still,
Yeah.
watch it. That kind of entertainment value of the horror as a genre that needs a kind of,
I know, and it's massively revived actually in books, in movies. It's always been there, but like
right,
something to do with COVID, something to do with whatever our climate change. All these kinds of things have led to a revival. Like those tools are sort of not enough. Though I
right.
do see that Jessica's coming in now into the studio, so let's ask her. We have so many questions and
I
hardly
know
answers.
about ghosts and our present moment. Hi,
Hi,
Jessica.
Jessica. Welcome. The question we've been debating, and we've gone over a bunch of things from our childhood, politics, all these kinds of things. But you're the real expert. So Jessica Faleiro is an actual ghost story writer. Your book is called Afterlife, which centers Goa as this place of colonial hauntings, but it's also about family. It's also about yourself, and these are wonderful, engaging stories. And I think you're the perfect person to talk to us about the question of banishing the ghosts from our past somehow. Why can't we do that? What are we? Where are we going wrong? Why do you have to keep living with them? And you've made ghosts the central topic of your work. So,
Yeah.
do you want to say what got you started on this topic?
Yes, thanks, Amrita and Bhakti, for having me here. Really love the chance to be able to talk about Ghosts, my book, anytime, actually. And we'll unpack a little bit about why that is as well. People, have this feeling around talking about ghosts, I think, that I've discovered since I've published the book. But yeah, so why was it you asked about the what haunts us and maybe what led me to write this book. And
Mhm.
so I had a ghostly experience, shall we say, when I was
Oh
10 years old.
gosh.
And that was actually something that stayed with me and that ended up haunting me to the point where 2 decades later, it helped me get something onto the page and actually write this book. So over the period of 2 decades as well,
Mhm.
the thing that happened, the episode that happened, stayed with me in such a vivid way that I started asking other people about their ghost stories. And so my book is actually an amalgam of lots of different true stories and true anecdotes, I guess, from collected from people around the world.
Hmm.
And yeah, so it ended up into my ghost story book. But yeah, I was also haunted by something then.
Yeah.
Oh, I want to know about that, Jessica. And your book did keep me up a lot of nights, I have to admit.
You're not the only person that said that. But
I
yeah,
guess that's a compliment for a ghost story writer. But I guess our question is also, can we banish the ghosts from our past? So we have towards the end of this conversation, we're going to have to find out if Jessica managed to banish anything, or she just stays awake at night scaring us and herself.
But
oh
I do
yeah,
want to
okay.
know what got you writing ghost stories initially.
Yeah. So I mean, so when I was 10 years old, so I'll tell you the story. So when I was 10 years old, I was visiting my grandmother and we were on holiday. So it was my parents and I at my grandmother's house in this very rural setting in Goa. And it was afternoon time, post lunch. Everyone was like, sated. Uh, the grown ups were still talking in the dining room and I was really bored. So we were really lived in an isolated spot, my grandmother, in the middle of nowhere. And so I went to the backyard, and just across the way was an elderly uncle's house that was boarded up. He had passed away a few years ago. And so there was this boarded up house that I knew no one was living in. And as I stood there and I was watching, I suddenly saw this lace curtain on the inside of a window starting to move as if
Oh
there was a
God.
breeze that caught it. And I was a very rational child. I remember this even now. I was a really rational child, even at 10. And I'm standing there going, oh, there's no wind. It was something like 2:33 in the afternoon, and Goa has this very particular kind of breeze that blows around then. But
Mm.
there was nothing. It was still air. And then I see this lace curtain moving. And then I look again at it while I'm doing all these calculations. And then I see this rocking chair just past the window on the inside starting to move. And I had
No.
no explanation for it. And people do say this, like, so the hair on the what do they say? The hair on the backs of your
Goosebumps.
arm, the back of your neck stands up. And I had that exact
Oh my
feeling.
God.
And I'm not the only one, I've learned in the 2 decades since. But cut to so then I call my mother out, and of course by then I'm like telling her what's happening, and I'm waiting for her to see something, and then everything is still again. So she's decided, oh, it's just a child story, and you're imagining it. And then the nugget for that incident stayed with me and has ended up in my book. But of course, my that's just a nugget in the book, and the book is like much bigger than that.
Mm-hmm.
But I never really had a resolution to that at that point of time. Actually, 9 years later, I did, because we found out, um, my grandmother and my uncles and my father were actually having a conversation, and they started mentioning my name. And I was like, what? And then, like, oh, you remember that thing that happened that you told us about 10 years ago? Whatever. I was like, yeah. And they're like, well, people have been citing a lot of weird things happening around the same house. It was still boarded up. So
Wow.
that creeped me out. I mean, I did not want to be around my grandmother's house
But that
for
had been a
years after that.
recent thing? Like,
No, so that
not
was
at that
so the
time.
first thing happened at 10 when I was age 10, and then
Mm.
cut to age 19 that happened. So I already had an interest in talking, about ghosts and ghost stories with people, and then this really freaked me out. So
Wow.
And this
so
was
people
your
had been,
family house?
yes, and so my no, well,
But it
yeah,
was
a
an
member
empty
of our
house, right?
family.
It was an
Sorry?
empty house.
It was a completely empty, boarded up house that, house disputes happen. They get,
Yeah.
in India, it's very common. It's just gets tied up in legal stuff for ages. And that's exactly what had happened to this house. And it was still boarded up. It was still like very decrepit. There was no
Mm-hmm.
one living there. And people used to see at this sort of afternoon time,
Mm-hmm.
a shepherd sort of person, a young boy in the courtyard, just sweeping the leaves. And as soon as someone from the neighborhood would come up to ask him, "Who are you and what are you doing here?" He
Mm-hmm.
would vanish before their eyes. I'd
But
never seen it. This was
did
the
it
story I was told.
wow, but did it force like some kind of conversation? Like, did weird stuff happen there? If you can share, like, with your
That's
family, or like what was, you know,
no idea. No idea.
there was an
So
unhappy presence there. Isn't that
Exactly.
what we would say?
So I think it ends up becoming difficult when you try to tie it in with something. Some ghosts can be tied in with. So I do write about psychological hauntings, and if you read like Henry
Yeah.
James' Turn of the Screw, when I was
Yeah.
doing my research for this, oh, it's such a amazing
Bone
example of,
chilling.
oh no, is it a psychological haunting or was it a real ghost? And you
Right.
just, researchers, scholarly researchers still haven't resolved that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just so much of a testament to his craft. But I got into this idea of psychological hauntings, and I think there are some things where, you can link it to, secrets and traumatic secrets being repressed, and
Yeah.
there's a
Wow.
psychological manifestation. But some are really inexplicable,
Mm.
and you may
Right.
never find the answers. Maybe it is something unresolved, which is what
Mm.
a lot of the narrative is sometimes. But maybe it's just there. They're just there because I do think there's something to be said about energy systems and the spirit world, and we
Mm.
live with a lot of things that our eyes are not capable of seeing. They're not necessarily evil or dangerous or anything like that. So that's what I think anyway. But yeah.
Aren't they? Oh God.
And you're coming out of this conversation, me and Bhakti, talking about what do we make out of this, right? Are these kinds of things, as you said, are they psychological horror? Are they unhappy presence, like Bhakti just mentioned, right? And the larger question is, how do you define this? What are ghosts then? When in this world we are, it's just so logical, or is this science or is this rational? How do you account for these phenomena like the story that you just told us?
So I think so. Okay, so you mentioned a nice thing here, which is, I think, the science and the rational, and I think a lot of the systems that we're set up in, the world systems that we're set up in, lean or want to lean towards the rational and the science. And the immediate question is,
Mhm.
okay, where's the proof? But there is this completely other world that exists without that kind of evidence. And it's a lot of experiential evidence, I think. So, for example, I mean, it's a very broad brush stereotype, but if I think of tribal societies, and I'm thinking of the Native American
Yeah.
societies right now, I mean, and
Hmm.
they've got their own, belief systems
Sure.
from nation to nation, but they live in the spirit realm in such a powerful, heavy way. And then they don't have this immediate. They don't have this immediate kind of, oh, rationality is everything we need to lean on. So I
Mhm.
think we miss out on so much of the world if we choose to think just that way as well. And
Mhm.
the brain is trained. I mean, we all come from
Yeah.
education systems which have trained us to think a certain way. And I think one of the things I've been doing in the last decade or so has been trying to train myself away from that, which is also, about getting more into my creativity and connecting more with my sense of intuition. And maybe I have the original ghost from age 10 to thank for that. I don't know, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think, like, before Amrita and I were talking also about this idea of being open to these experiences. Like, I'm not someone who is open to experiences. I want to close my eyes and put the blanket over my head, or I don't know, something. That's why what's terrifying about your story is that it happens in broad daylight at 2 p.m.
Right.
That's the
Right.
scariest type of, like, TV shows also. Those,
It could
like the
happen
still
anytime.
woods and the tiny, crackling of the leaves or something. That's the scariest type of, like, ghost stuff to watch as well. But speaking of this idea of being open to that experience, something about the self, is it something within us? I guess I'm still seeking psychological explanations. Is it something within us that's trying to make sense of trauma? You used the word before.
Right. Right.
Family secrets,
Yeah.
something that you've been coping with, holding in. Do we need to listen to ghosts from the past, whatever you want to call them? Or, like, is this something you actively have tried to do? Or,
Oh, couple of things. Let me hold two different threads. One thing you said, and then the other thing you said. Is this something? So I had it hasn't happened lately, but I kind of try and stay open to spirits. I think I'm more in tune with energies, but not so much spirits. So when I was living in London, so let's say 20 between 2007 2009, I think it might have
Mhm.
been. I was staying in this house in Kentish Town, and we had a two-floor bedroom, and I was sharing it with um, a good friend of mine. And she had the flat facing the road with the noise, and I had the flat facing the still and the back with the trees. And there were two different nights, separate, apart from each other, where I heard my name being whispered in my ear at
What?
night.
Oh my goodness.
I was asleep
Jessica.
and I heard my name. Someone else was speaking my name. And I remember waking up and going, am I saying my name in my sleep, and waking myself up? And then I went back to sleep. And it
Oh my
wasn't. So the
goodness.
second time I heard my name, I woke up and I saw a white thing at the end of my bed, like a hovering
Mm.
white thing.
Oh
And
my goodness.
and in my book there is like this diaphanous, it's a very typical ghost motif, the diaphanous white woman or whatever. The funny thing is, I remember my reaction to it. Like the first time, I was like exactly what you described, Bhakti. It's like, oh, quilt over my head, it's gonna go away. The second time, I was kind of like, oh gosh, what does it want? And my rationality kicked in.
Oh my
My brain
God.
was like, okay, it has nothing to do with me. It's just there. Just
Uh-huh.
accept it, and go back to sleep. And which
But
I
you didn't
did.
want to find out what it was? You didn't want to
No,
get up?
no.
Oh my.
No. So for
Okay.
me, it's like actually having this acceptance of it's there, and there's no
Mm.
conversation needed. There's no frustration. I need to tie up with it. Um, so yeah, and after having that kind of experience, I'm kind of more like, Yeah, they're among us. Okay, it has nothing to do with me. They're just around.
Huh.
That is
Yeah,
spooky.
I was trying to prove that it's about you, about me. Like you're
Right.
open to something, you're seeking something, and the answers are sort of coming or something.
Yes, so the other I picked up the other thread now. So intergenerational trauma. So there is
Mm.
a whole study about how um, intergenerational trauma through the ages or through different whatever family, 4 or 5 generations, secrets can be deeply hidden and then they come out in other ways. And one of the ways is they can be manifestations in sort of ghostly ways or things that haunt you. And the person, 5 generations, 4 generations later has no idea what has happened 4 generations or 5 generations ago. And there is
Right.
this weird stuff happening in their house or in a family member or whatever. So you do have people that kind of record these things. So here's an interesting thing. One of the first talks I gave when I was talking about my book, someone in the audience was a clinical psychologist, and she approached
Wow.
me afterwards. And so the first thing was people in the audience asked me, "Do you believe in ghosts?" And I said, "I believe in people's experience of
Hmm.
ghosts. So I believe when people say to me, 'Oh, I saw a ghost,' or whatever it is, they describe the story. Um, and I believe that they have experienced something where they're like, 'Oh, it's a ghost. Oh, it's paranormal. This happened to me,' and it's so real to them." So I do say that to people. I still believe that. The thing the clinical psychologist said to me was, I am such a rational person. Exactly. Evidence based. There's a reason for
Right.
people's understanding of exorcisms and possession. And she was explaining it all to me. There's research saying how the face contorts itself and it looks like a different person. And so the person thinks it's a devil possessing you and everything. She explained everything to me. And
Mm.
then she said, "But I recently lost my mother. And it was
Oh,
such a huge loss for me that one day when I was walking on the beach, I had this blinding, overpowering experience that my mother appeared to me, and we ended up having a 1 hour conversation." And she's like, "I have no
wow.
explanation for that as a clinical psychologist, but to this day, I believe it's completely real." And she said that's why she came to my talk. She was like,
That's a beautiful
so
story,
and
though.
It is a great story. I just got
she
goosebumps also.
yeah. So I mean, I'm sure there are enough
Mm.
psychologists out there who have rational explanations, but this is
Mm.
why I said I think there's a whole realm that is I don't know, not it's just there. There may never be answers. We may never know the answers. They're just mysterious to us.
Yeah.
But they're just people around us and
Yeah.
well, spirits around us. Yeah.
But
Um,
Jessica, you were talking about something that is fascinating, intergenerational trauma. And Bhakti, you mentioned the colonial haunting, and I want to go back to the book Afterlife. And Goa itself lends a presence of this kind of ghostliness, the space itself, right? And you talk about this kind of past coming back, repressed, how it then becomes a ghostliness in the present time. So there's a political aspect to the haunting, right?
Mm.
yeah.
So can you talk about this kind of colonial haunting? How does one politicize ghosts?
Yeah, I think there's a pretty much a long established tradition of sort of the Gothic story and the Gothic tradition being rooted in the whole post-colonial empire building scenario. And then it was seen as a yeah, as a trope, a means of explaining otherness and the Orient and
Mm.
all of these things to a group of people, to the colonizers who were,
Yeah.
dealing with a huge amount of uncertainty and newness. And it was a very convenient way of packaging it as, the Gothic story, which took off wildly as a genre
Yes.
at that time. I mean,
Mm.
yeah, and I can see why, so from Walpole writing the Castle of Otranto in the what is it, 18th century, yeah, in
Mm.
1700 something or the other, and then 200, 300 years later, to Dickens and the Christmas Carol, and so it
Yeah.
really captured something in people's minds. And yes, it was
Mhm.
a very political, um, psychological, sociological thing that was being packaged in this way. And if you look at it from the Goan context, so one of the stories First of all, I have a diaspora, Goan diaspora family in there, which is all about the movements. And Goans have been moving ever since they figured
Mm,
out how to board a ship. So since the colonization by the Portuguese, you have stories of Goans on caravels and all of that sort of
sure.
thing. But you also have I have the Portuguese Inquisition as one of the stories in there, because I think not very
Mhm.
much is written about it, and it was a significant period of Goa's history, a horrible period. Many horrible things happened, but also people don't realize that it was the coming of the Nuevos Cristos. So the inception of the Inquisition in Goa, in particular, the Portuguese Inquisition, was to catch hold of the Sephardic Jews that had migrated from Spain and Portugal,
Right.
come
Wow.
to Goa and were escaping persecution. And then the Inquisition, a few decades later, followed them to Goa. And then
Mm.
from there, it branched out into persecution of other religions. So that haunting is something that I wanted to bring, and that's part of the intergenerational trauma in the story as well. Yeah, one of the priests there is part of the Inquisition, and
Yeah.
yeah.
That's incredible. Yeah, Amrita, when Amrita and I were chatting before you came, she was talking about various things like that in Calcutta as well.
Calcutta, yeah.
Yeah, so yes, I think there is a lot of there are small cultural ways in which collectively people are always kind of coping with ghosts or dealing with ghosts or keeping them alive or trying to banish them, all those kinds of things. Do you feel that everyone's after the same thing? You know what I mean? Like, do you like, there are so many various, like Native Americans engage with ghosts in a particular way. Indians, Hindus and their conception of ghosts is very different, I would say, from like Christian or Muslim, or there's just so many cultural specificities. But is everyone engaging with ghosts in some form or the other for the same thing? If my question is too vague, we can move on. But like, are we all seeking the same thing when we are engaging with just ghosts in general, as a country, as a Goa, as individuals?
I'm
And we
not
need
clear what
both.
the same thing means. So yeah, I'm
Like the same
wondering. Yeah.
thing. Like, are we trying to deal with the past? Is it about history? Is it about coping with history? Is it about connecting with loved ones that have gone away? Is it
Or that
about
kind of boundary, right? That you're talking about living and dead. There's always that kind of need to reach beyond. Is it all of that?
reach the past or
Probably
get an
all of the
answer?
above and some more.
What's the which
Yeah,
more?
yeah. So probably everything you mentioned and some more. It's a way of helping us understand things that are beyond our understanding at this point in time, whatever
Mm.
it may be. So,
Yeah.
like if I think of the example of how I mentioned the Gothic story came around, people had no concept. So there was so much disconnect between within what was happening in empire.
Hmm.
The colonizers and the colonized were so disconnected from each other. Nobody knew what was actually happening. They relied on narration and accounts, and a lot of people were illiterate. So for them to have these stories, and ghost stories translate very well because it's the oral tradition, the oral storytelling tradition that they're seeped in.
Yeah.
Um, so I think, yeah, I mean, if I think about the tribal tradition, it keeps traditions alive.
Yeah. Yeah.
Some of them being, steeped in fear, and so we want to use ghosts as a way of control, a means of control.
Yeah.
Um, there's also that. So that's the and more
Yeah.
dot dot
Yeah.
dot dot.
No, of course.
You know,
No, you're right about the fear part, because one thing about like engaging with like Halloween or whatever, all these different things, and the addiction to like genre movies, right? Horror
Yeah.
films, ghost films, whatever, is about and then I connected also to like people who are like desperate for like these roller coaster rides. Like, we really want to be afraid for a minute and
Yeah.
then we want to have overcome it, you know and there is something about inviting fear and then controlling it, as you said. But I know that Amrita had a question about
I
something
was
else you do, Jessica.
well, I was thinking all of this relates to you also moonlighting as a tarot reader. And I suspect that a lot of our viewers who are listening in are interested in that aspect, how do we deal with the ghosts of our past, or this aspect of what, tarot reading is um, in that kind of realm of
Or even
ghosts,
astrology and all,
or even astrology, right? But I do think there's some kind of difference between
Difference.
both the
Sure, sure.
things. But if we talked about this kind of rationality and science, so it is not enough. You said that there's something beyond, with that excellent example you gave of the psychologist giving you that story. So why do we then need this less proven, often mocked? I mean, tarot reading is mocked right now, or has always been.
Hmm.
Tell us about your experience in that area.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't know. So I've been drawn to it for a very long time, and I picked up a pack of cards rather randomly, maybe, yeah, 20 plus years ago. But I didn't really get into it until about 5 years ago, professionally. And in between, I'd gone to a couple of tarot card readers more out of interest. I think people go to tarot card readers or astrologers. Well, astrology is a little different because in the Hindu tradition, it's very much a part of your family tradition of going and
Sure.
seeing someone. It's very predictive as well. So
Yeah.
Yes.
tarot card readers, their own style varies, you know, from one person to another. And I have a more intuitive style, I would say, and
Mm.
that's actually a clue to how I've regarded it. So as I began to understand how tarot card reading worked, it really helped me connect more deeply with my intuition, which really helped me with my creative writing, which
Mm,
then
wow.
fed back to the tarot card reading. So there was this wonderful cyclical thing happening with me deepening my own intuition and just having, in a way, the freedom to connect with it more powerfully. That sort of fueled my writing in a very powerful way. And yeah, I do readings for people, and there are things, more often than not, I find what happens is people have the answers within them already. And so I end up telling them the story. This is, the tarot cards have specific visuals, pictures around them, on
Yeah.
them, and numbers and colors. And so you, as a tarot card reader, you're trained to make meaning out of them. And then you lay out some cards randomly, and then you tell the person sitting across from you the story you're seeing. And so, I
Mhm.
mean, I love that. It's another form of storytelling in a way. And then I'm narrating what I'm seeing. And then I ask them for some context, and I'm like checking with them and that sort of thing. But then that's mostly, I find that it connects with what is already happening with people, that they already, at a subconscious or unconscious level, they want to know something. So you come to a tarot card reader because you're steeped in uncertainty about something, and you just want to calm it down, and you're
Right.
like, all right, I'm going to see this person. And so it
Yeah.
kind of connects with stuff that's inside of you that's already there, but you're doing a sifting. You're helping the person do a sifting, and
Of
then
course.
this happens.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's
Beautiful.
my experience of it. Very few times weird predictive things have happened with me, but I tell people, there's no, the premise
Yeah.
is, this is not, and this is not a substitute for therapy. I do say that as well. So no, if you
Yeah.
have, talk therapy is very different from tarot
Right.
card reading. Although
Jessica,
it is healing.
we are
Yeah.
running out of time, but I did have one question for you. You're going to laugh at this question, but like, you just talked about writing, like you write, your storytelling is helped by the tarot card readings, all of this stuff, and that there is a kind of attempt at narrativizing, expressing all these experiences with people, with yourself, with your own family, your life. Uh, all does it all help? Like, are you really free? Like, you know what I mean? Like, are you free of fear, or like, have you banished the ghosts from your past
It
because of all these things?
sounds like she is free of fear if she can lay in bed with
Has
the
she
so,
banished?
ghost.
so I'm not going to laugh at your question, but you're going to laugh at my answer for sure. So
Okay.
one of the things is, I cannot write ghost stories or anything scary before sunset. Like, I have to stop at sunset, 5 o'clock,
What?
and I'm done. Even my book, because my imagination would get into the research or the stories in such a vivid way, I would be having these dreams keeping me up at night. So I have to stop when it's ghost stories in particular. I have to just stop at 5 o'clock. So yeah, I mean, I would scare myself with my own stories. So yeah,
Oh my
I don't.
goodness.
Yeah, so I knew you would laugh at that. The other question you asked was, what did you ask? Sorry, the second part.
No,
I mean,
that
do
you
they
have
ever?
managed these ghosts.
Yeah.
Have I banished these ghosts? So the interesting thanks. So the interesting thing about that is, I think, like I said at the start, I had this haunted event that then haunted me,
Mhm.
and then when I wrote it out onto the page, so the raw draft of the book, if you like, there was one level of catharsis, like okay, it's now on the page, but that was nothing compared to once it was published and it was out there, and I started having conversations about the book with people, and even now, like 10, 11 years later, that has been more, yeah, I'm done with that. That incident is like, okay, I only talk about it when I need to. It's just uh given me so much other stuff. So yeah, that's whole part of
Right.
my life
You
is
managed, you
so cleared
succeeded
out.
in putting it away somehow.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and it's given me a lot of clarifications in other ways. Like I'm more accepting of these native realms and spiritual realms and other ways of being as a
Yeah.
consequence of it. So yeah, there's no fear about those stepping into those places, and tarot card reading as well. There's no fear about doing those things. I
Well,
think, yeah,
you're
I've
very
got
inspiring.
It
Amrita
is.
and I are inspired.
And a
Thank you.
little scared.
Oh,
Don't be scared. Nothing to be scared of. Gosh, message me if you start to get any
Hey,
like
I'm
weird
lighthearted, so
dreams
I
tonight.
am definitely not reading these stories after sunset for myself.
thank you
Don't
so much
say
for
that.
joining us, Jessica. That was
Thank you,
wonderful.
Jessica.
My pleasure. Nice chatting with you both. Thank you.
We'll be back on the wire next week with another question, another exciting guest, and more conversation.